In December 1945, John Maynard Keynes sat across from American negotiators in Washington, D.C., exhausted. Britain had won the war but lost everything else. The empire was bankrupt. 6 years of total war had drained the treasury, decimated exports, and left Britain owing more money than any nation in history. Without immediate American aid, the pound would collapse, imports would stop, and Britain would face mass starvation by spring. The Americans knew it. They had a number, $3.75 billion, about $30 billion today. Alone, they called it. But the terms would be brutal. Britain would have to dismantle imperial preferences, make sterling convertible, open its markets, and accept American economic dominance. Everything the empire was built on gone. Keynes called it Montague Norman's revenge from the grave. Churchill raged privately, but they had no choice. What happened next would end 300 years of British global supremacy, not with bombs but with a balance sheet. To understand how Britain arrived at this moment of financial desperation, we need to go back to September 1939. When war broke out, Britain was still the world's largest creditor nation. The city of London remained the financial capital of the world. Sterling was the global reserve currency. A quarter of humanity lived under British rule. The empire controlled critical resources from Malayan rubber to Middle Eastern oil to Indian cotton. Britain's overseas investments totaled over £3.5 billion, approximately £200 billion in today's money. But total war doesn't run on prestige. It runs on dollars, steel, oil, and food. And Britain had a fatal weakness. It couldn't feed itself. The island nation imported 70% of its food. It relied on merchant shipping to bring wheat from Canada, meat from Argentina, and oil from Persia. When German U-boats began sinking those ships by the hundreds, Britain faced a simple equation: fight and starve or surrender and survive. Churchill chose to fight, but fighting meant spending. By 1941, Britain was spending £15 million per day on the war effort, more than its entire annual GDP in some pre-war years. The government bought every weapon, ship, and aircraft it could produce domestically, then turned to America for more. Tanks, planes, ammunition, food, everything came with a price tag, and America demanded payment in gold or dollars. Britain's gold reserves evaporated. In 1940, the Treasury secretly shipped £450 million in gold bullion across the Atlantic, the largest movement of wealth in history. When the gold ran out, Britain liquidated overseas investments. American securities, South American railways, anything that could be sold was sold at fire sale prices. When those were gone, Britain began selling the empire itself piece by piece, asset by asset. Then came Lend-Lease in March 1941. Roosevelt's masterstroke allowed Britain to receive American supplies without immediate payment. "Lend me your garden hose to put out my fire," Roosevelt told America, "and I'll return it when the fire is out." Britain received $31 billion in Lend-Lease aid, about $550 billion today. Kept Britain fighting. It also made Britain dependent. But Lend-Lease came with strings. America demanded Britain eliminate its imperial preference system, the tariff arrangements that gave empire members favorable trade terms. They wanted access to British markets. They wanted sterling weakened and the dollar strengthened. They wanted, fundamentally, to reshape the post-war economic order with America at its center and Britain as a cooperative subordinate. The War Cabinet understood what was happening. Leo Amery, Secretary of State for India, wrote in his diary, "We are being reduced to the status of a pensioner of the United States." But what choice did they have? Lose the empire through economic concessions, or lose it to Hitler? They chose the former, betting they could rebuild afterward. They were wrong. By 1945, Britain's financial position was catastrophic. External debts totaled £3.5 billion, nearly 4 times pre-war levels. Most of this was sterling balances, IOUs to India, Egypt, and other colonies that had supplied goods and services on credit during the war. India alone held £1.3 billion in sterling debts. These countries had fed and equipped Britain's war machine, accepting payment in promises. Britain's export capacity had collapsed. 6 years of bombing had destroyed factories. The The best workers had been in uniform, not on production lines. Industries had been converted to war production and couldn't quickly retool. Meanwhile, America's industries had expanded massively, flooding global markets with cheap goods. British exports in 1945 were barely one-third of 1938 levels. The gold reserves were gone, down from £864 million in 1939 to £450 million in 1945, and falling. Britain was burning through £2 billion per year more than it earned. At that rate, complete bankruptcy would arrive in months. The Treasury calculated Britain needed at least £1.5 billion in external financing just to avoid economic collapse, and another £1 billion for reconstruction. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. Victory in Europe had come in May. Britain had won the war. The celebrations in London streets lasted for days. But in the Treasury, the champagne tasted bitter. Because that same day, President Truman signed an order. Lend-Lease would terminate immediately. Not after a transition period. Not after Britain stabilized. Immediately. The impact was devastating. Britain had been receiving over £2 billion annually in Lend-Lease aid. It covered food imports, raw materials, and industrial supplies. Without it, Britain couldn't feed its population or run its factories. Truman's decision wasn't malicious. The American Congress had authorized Lend-Lease only for wartime, and the war was over. But the effect was the same. Britain faced economic catastrophe. Lord Keynes, the most famous economist in the world, was dispatched to Washington with a desperate mission: secure a massive grant or interest-free loan to bridge Britain to recovery. Keynes was 62, in failing health, and about to face the worst negotiation of his career. Keynes arrived in Washington in September 1945 expecting gratitude. Britain had stood alone against Hitler for a year before America entered the war. British soldiers, pilots, and sailors had died by the hundreds of thousands defending freedom. Surely America would help its closest ally rebuild? The Americans had other ideas. The chief negotiators were Fred Vinson, Secretary of the Treasury, and William Clayton, Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs. Both were hardline free traders who saw Britain's imperial preference system as an obstacle to American prosperity. They had watched Britain's empire extract wealth from colonies, exclude American goods, and maintain the sterling zone as a closed trading bloc. Now Britain was vulnerable, and they intended to use that vulnerability. Keynes opened by proposing justice, a $6 billion interest-free loan, or better yet, a grant. He argued Britain deserved it for its wartime sacrifice. The Americans listened politely, then presented their counteroffer: a commercial loan at market interest rates, conditional on Britain eliminating imperial preferences within 1 year and making sterling fully convertible, meaning anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars at any time. Keynes was stunned. Making sterling convertible while Britain was bankrupt would trigger a catastrophic run on the pound. Every holder of sterling balances, India, Egypt, Argentina, would immediately convert to dollars, draining Britain's reserves in weeks. It was economic suicide. As for eliminating imperial preferences, that meant dismantling the economic basis of the empire itself. The Ottawa Agreements of 1932 had created a protected trading zone spanning a quarter of the world. Without it, British exports couldn't compete with cheaper American goods. The negotiations turned brutal. The Americans wouldn't budge on convertibility or imperial preferences. They offered $3.75 billion, half what Keynes requested, at 2% interest. Keynes argued the interest rate was usurious for a wartime ally. The Americans pointed out that 2% was below commercial rates, and they were taking substantial risk lending to a nearly bankrupt nation. Week after week, Keynes fought. He threatened that Britain would turn to bilateral trade deals and closed currency blocks if America didn't help. The Americans knew this was a bluff. Britain was too weak for economic isolation. They waited. Keynes's health deteriorated under the stress. He suffered chest pains and struggled to sleep. Back in London, the cabinet debated. The left wing, led by Aneurin Bevan, argued Britain should reject the loan and pursue socialist autarky, government control of trade, continued rationing, and bilateral deals with Europe and the Commonwealth. The right wing, led by Churchill, wanted to accept the loan but renegotiate better terms. The center, led by Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Chancellor Hugh Dalton, faced reality. Britain had no leverage. They were running out of money. Without a loan, sterling would collapse, imports would cease, and Britain would face food riots by spring. In November, the American negotiators added another condition. Britain would join the International Monetary Fund and World Bank, institutions designed by America to manage the post-war economic order. Britain would have to accept international oversight of its economic policies. For a nation that had dictated global finance for 2 centuries, this was humiliation. Keynes cabled London with increasing desperation. The Americans wouldn't improve their terms. It was take this loan or face economic catastrophe. On December 6, 1945, after 12 weeks of negotiations, Keynes accepted defeat. The Anglo-American Financial Agreement was signed. Britain would receive $3.75 billion at 2% interest, repayable over 50 years starting in 1951. In exchange, Britain would make sterling convertible within 1 year, begin dismantling imperial preferences immediately, and join the Bretton Woods institutions under American leadership. Keynes returned to London exhausted and depressed. He told friends he'd been outwitted and outmaneuvered by the Americans. He died 4 months later, at age 62, many believing the stress of the negotiations had killed him. The loan agreement went to Parliament in December 1945. The debate was furious. Conservative Robert Boothby called it an economic Munich. Labour MP Emmanuel Shinwell said Britain was selling its birthright for a mess of pottage. Even Churchill, who supported the loan as necessary, privately raged about American sharp practice and exploitation of Britain's weakness. But the math was undeniable. Without the loan, Britain would run out of foreign currency by March 1946. Imports would stop. Factories would close for lack of raw materials. Food rationing, already severe, would become starvation. The government would collapse. On December 13th, Parliament approved the loan 345 votes to 98. It wasn't enthusiasm, it was surrender to arithmetic. The $3.75 billion arrived in early 1946. In today's money, about $60 billion, though in terms of economic impact, closer to $500 billion given Britain's shrunken GDP. It was the largest loan in history at that time. Britain used it to pay for food imports, raw materials, and oil, kept the lights on and prevented immediate collapse. But it also locked Britain into the terms that would end its empire. The immediate financial relief was real but temporary. Britain still ran massive trade deficits. The money was spent within months on essential imports. By mid-1946, Britain was again approaching crisis, living loan payment to loan payment like a family maxing out credit cards to pay rent. But the real cost wasn't the debt, it was the conditions. In July 1947, as required by the loan agreement, Britain made sterling convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes had predicted: catastrophic. Within weeks, holders of sterling balances began converting to dollars. India, Egypt, Argentina, and others, all owed billions in wartime debts, rushed to exchange their pounds. Britain's gold and dollar reserves, rebuilt with the American loan, evaporated. In just 6 weeks, Britain lost $1 billion in reserves. The convertibility experiment lasted 37 days before the government suspended it in panic. But the damage was done. Sterling's credibility as a reserve currency was shattered. The world now knew. The pound was weak, Britain was weak, and the dollar was the only stable currency. The financial foundation of British power, sterling's role as the global reserve currency, was broken forever. The second condition proved equally devastating. Eliminating imperial preferences meant British goods lost their protected markets. Indian textiles, Canadian wheat, Australian wool, all had been captive markets for British manufacturers through preferential tariffs. Now they were open to American competition, and American goods, produced in undamaged factories with modern equipment, were cheaper and better. British exports to the Empire collapsed. Industries that had relied on colonial markets contracted sharply. Unemployment in northern England's mill towns soared as textile exports vanished. The Midlands engineering firms lost markets to American competitors. Britain's post-war recovery stalled as its natural export markets disappeared. But the most profound impact was political. The loan conditions made the empire economically unviable. Britain could no longer afford to garrison troops across Africa and Asia while bankrupt at home. The costs of colonial administration exceeded any benefits once preferential trade ended. More importantly, Britain could no longer pay the sterling debts it owed to the colonies. India presented the impossible equation. Britain owed India £1.3 billion in wartime debts money India had lent by providing soldiers, supplies, and resources on credit. Now India wanted payment. But Britain was bankrupt. The only solution was political. Grant India independence and negotiate the debt away. In August 1947, less than 2 years after the loan agreement, India became independent. The jewel in the crown was gone. The pattern repeated across the empire. Burma, Ceylon, Palestine, each gained independence in rapid succession, partly from nationalist pressure but also because Britain simply couldn't afford to stay. The military presence, the administrative costs, the debt obligations, all became untenable for a nation dependent on American loans. In Africa, the timeline was slower but the logic identical. Ghana became independent in 1957, Nigeria in 1960, Kenya in 1963. By 1970, virtually the entire British Empire had been dissolved. The territories that had made Britain a superpower for 300 years were gone. What Hitler's armies couldn't achieve, a loan agreement accomplished in 25 years. The financial dependence proved permanent. Britain repaid the 1945 loan over 61 years, making the final payment in 2006. But the deeper cost wasn't the interest, it was the loss of economic sovereignty. Britain's economy was restructured to serve the American-led global order. Sterling became a secondary currency. British banks operated under Bretton Woods rules designed in Washington. British trade policy aligned with American interests. The special relationship, as Churchill called it, was real, but it was the relationship between creditor and debtor, patron and client. Britain retained prestige, a UN Security Council seat, and nuclear weapons. But economically, it was a middle power dependent on American goodwill and integrated into an American-led system. The empire's end had consequences that echoed for generations. The partition of India killed perhaps 1 million people. The rushed decolonization of Africa left artificial borders and weak states that collapsed into civil wars. The Palestine withdrawal without resolution created a conflict that continues today. These weren't inevitable outcomes. They resulted partly from Britain's hasty retreat, driven by financial desperation. The loan also established the template for American power. Where Britain had ruled through military occupation and colonial administration, America would rule through economic integration and financial dependence. The Marshall Plan, the IMF, the World Bank, all followed the logic established in the 1945 Anglo-American negotiations. Lend money, impose conditions, reshape economies to fit American interests. It was empire without colonies, dominance through debt rather than direct rule. For Britain, the illusion of power persisted longer than the reality. Politicians spoke of global influence and punching above Britain's weight. The military maintained bases east of Suez until 1971. But the foundation was gone. When Britain tried to act independently, as in the 1956 Suez Crisis, America simply threatened to crash the pound, and Britain retreated in humiliation. In less than a decade, a loan agreement had accomplished what centuries of rivals couldn't. It ended British supremacy. The transaction was clean, $3.75 billion for an empire. The Americans got a world restructured for their benefit, open markets, dollar dominance, and British subordination. Britain got survival, but at the cost of everything that had made survival worth having. The empire that had been built over 300 years, that had ruled the waves and painted the map red, that had defeated Napoleon and survived Hitler, fell not to invasion or revolution but to a balance sheet. In August 1945, Britain was a great power. By 1947, it was a debtor nation negotiating its decline. The price? $3.75 billion. The cost? Everything.